Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Real Food on Trial, How the Diet Dictators Tried to Destroy a Top Scientist, by Dr. Tim Noakes and Marika Sboros, narrated by Kleinman and Corrie James. Forward. This book is essential listening, not just for medical doctors, scientists, and academics who want to practice evidence-based medicine. It is for everyone concerned with scientific truth and medical ethics and morality. It is for ordinary mortals navigating the conflicting world of nutrition research amid growing fears for personal and planetary health. Real Food on Trial is a real-world tale of the dangers facing those who dare to swim against the medical scientific tide by challenging orthodoxy. It is also a glimpse into the ugly global phenomenon of academic bullying, or mobbing as it is now known. This book is the logical extension of a moment frozen in time in the Arctic, just before midnight on July 15, 2007, when many people thought I might be about to die. As I dived into the sub-zero waters at the North Pole, I also thought I might die. I was wearing nothing but a Speedo swimsuit, the old-fashioned kind that barely covers what needs to be covered. The water temperature was minus 1.7 degrees Celsius, 29 degrees Fahrenheit. I was challenging conventional wisdom about human physiology and the effects of extreme cold water swims in one of the world's most inhospitable, high-consequence environments. I was attempting a first-ever 1-kilometer swim across an open patch of sea at the North Pole. Many had said that the swim was impossible and could result in my death. I planned it as a symbolic swim to graphically show world leaders the impact of climate change in the region. I would never have achieved that swim were it not for the co-author of this book, Professor Tim Noakes. He's a man of extraordinary intellect and integrity, a medical doctor and world-renowned scientist who was part of the team of experts from 10 nations that I assembled to help me safely undertake that swim. From the time I first broached the idea of the swim, Tim was fully on board. He became my team doctor, scientific advisor, coach, mentor, ally, and, along the way, my very dear friend. He was probably the only one with me on the North Pole swim who did not believe that I might die. Tim believed that, not just because of his faith in me and my willingness and ability to go beyond the limits to human physiology and endurance. He believed because he had first done all the rigorous scientific research to determine whether the swim was possible. He used that scientific evidence to devise the program of meticulous planning and preparation that kept me safe and ensured my success. In other words, Tim did what comes naturally to him and all good scientists. Thorough research, after which he went with the evidence. With that, he changed my life forever. The more I've come to know Tim, the more I realize how much we have in common. We were both born abroad, he in Zimbabwe, I in Britain, and grew up in South Africa. We both loved wilderness areas and animals. And we are both graduates of the University of Cape Town, he in medicine and sports science, I in law. Tim continues to fight against well-resourced food and drug industries that disregard the science on optimum nutrition to treat and beat chronic life-threatening disease in the pursuit of profit who refuse to change. I continue to fight equally well-resourced multinational gas and oil companies that are directly causing climate change and who likewise refuse to change, despite all the scientific evidence. We are both involved in a race against time, spurred in my case by an awakening to the dangers of climate change to planetary and personal health, and in Tim's case, his epiphanous Damascene moment, as he calls it in this book. That was late in 2010, when he realized that much of what he knew about nutrition, health, and healing was wrong. You only have to look at rising levels of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease in the US, UK, and many other countries to see the dangers. You only have to put your head in the sea to see how little life there is remaining. Tim and I have a passion for the pursuit of truth and justice, and a natural antipathy towards bullies and liars. But there is one very big difference between Tim and me, as this book shows. The shockingly high price he has paid professionally, emotionally, and financially for his latest challenge to orthodoxy. This book gives evidence on public record for that price and those who forced him to pay it. When I started reading Real Food on Trial, I couldn't stop. It is a riveting read. It lays bare the lengths to which many of South Africa's most prominent doctors, dietitians, and academics were prepared to go to try to silence Tim on the subject of nutrition. Tim's co-author of this book is South African investigative and health journalist Marika Sboros. Her invaluable contribution has been to take her forensic journalist's pen to report on and analyze the implications of what the public dubbed the nutrition trial of the 21st century. That was the hearing that country's regulatory body, the Health Professions Council of South Africa, HPCSA, instituted against Tim. Marika was the first journalist to spot the breaking story and to expose the organized campaign to discredit Tim behind it. She also exposes the roots of the academic mobbing and those that laid the fertile ground for the hearing to happen. The charge was unprofessional conduct for a single tweet. The hearing dragged on for more than 4 years at a cost of more than 10 million rand for the HPCSA alone. Tim's legal costs would have been just as high had members of his top legal team not offered their services for free from the outset, so certain were they that he was the victim of a scientific witch hunt. All over a single tweet in which he gave his opinion on good first foods for infants. As this book shows, the HPCSA used that tweet to go to war with the distinguished scientist Tim on behalf of the dietetic profession in South Africa. From the outset, I'd always thought that at heart, the HPCSA's case against Tim was a freedom of speech issue. I read law at UCT at a seminal time when the apartheid era was finally staggering to its end. I was privileged to have as my lecturers some of South Africa's most respected minds. They included Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Constitutional Court judges Albie Sachs and Cato Reagan. I will never forget the moment when one of my lecturers held up a copy of South Africa's new constitution, which enshrined the right to free speech. So I was troubled when the HPCSA went to war with Tim on the basis of his scientific opinion on nutrition. After all, it's one thing to deny the Holocaust or to say something that incites racial, religious hatred or violence. It's quite another to say that you think meat, fish, chicken, eggs, and dairy are good first foods for infants. I must confess, I feel a little guilty about my contribution to the battle Tim has faced, and that is the focus of this book. I urged him to start using Twitter. I introduced him to the social network, the instrument that landed him in scientific hot water in the first place. But as Marika and Tim make clear in the closing chapter of this book, the HPCSA's case could never have got off the ground were it not for an incestuous web of UCT academics that spread to other top universities. The uncontested evidence for that web is all there, in this book and available on public record. And what has left me more disturbed is the involvement of academics from UCT, my and Tim's alma mater, a university which was once a bastion of free speech during the apartheid era. My opinion, which this book supports, is that the medical, dietetic, and academic establishments got it all wrong in the way they treated him. Instead of getting together, having a robust, collegial debate arguing on the basis of data, doctors, academics, and dietitians became a public lynch mob. The extensive evidence in this book points to deliberate malice. I'm not a nutrition scientist, and therefore I can't say definitively whether Tim is right or wrong on the science of low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets. I leave that to Tim and the other experts involved in this case and the extensive and compelling evidence for his opinions that they have presented. What I can say is that it's immaterial whether time proves him right or wrong. The fact is that the case against him should never have happened. There were many and far better ways for the experts to disagree with him and to advance science. This book is ultimately about Tim's remarkable journey. I've never met anyone politer or more dignified in the face of a relentless barrage of rude, disrespectful, and often defamatory public attacks than him. I marvel at the consistent willingness he displays to engage with these critics and debate openly on appropriate platforms, and how driven he is to always do the right thing. What Tim's trial and this book also ultimately prove is that institutions rarely create change, and by their very nature are cumbersome beasts, slow, unresponsive, often brutally destructive of those who get in their way. It is up to individuals dedicated to truth and justice and the small teams of experts supporting them to drive change. This book is a tribute to the power and dedication of those individuals and teams. Real Food on Trial tells an inspirational tale, and so far the ending has been a happy one. That does not mean Tim's battles with the establishment forces are yet over. Lewis Pugh, endurance swimmer and patron of the oceans, Cape Town, South Africa, January 2019. Preface. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events, and in the total of those acts will be written the history of this generation. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly. Robert F. Kennedy, Ripple of Hope speech delivered in Jameson Hall, University of Cape Town, South Africa, 6 June 1966. As the skilled and professional people of South Africa and the world, you will be largely removed from contact with the hungry and the deprived, those without ease in the present or hope in the future. It will require a constant effort of will to keep contact, to remind ourselves every day that we who diet have a never-ceasing obligation to those who starve. Robert F. Kennedy, speaking at the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa, 7 June 1966. Once upon a time, long, long ago in another world, I was considered quite a good scientist. Since 2004, the South African National Research Foundation, NRF, has rated me an A1 scientist for both exercise science and nutrition. That is the NRF's highest possible rating, signifying that the Foundation judges me to be a world leader in my fields. I've published more than 500 scientific papers, many in leading international peer-reviewed journals, and have been cited more than 17,000 times in scientific literature. My scientific H-index stands at over 70 for all my research outputs and at over 40 for those publications dealing exclusively with nutrition. The H, or Hirsch Index, is a measure of the impact of a scientist's work. I've won several important scientific awards, including a South African Presidential Order, the Order of Mapungubwe, Silver, and an NRF Lifetime Achievement Award, making me one of few at my alma mater, the University of Cape Town, UCT, to have won this award. For 25 years, an unusually long time, I directed a research unit funded by the South African Medical Research Council, SAMRC. Throughout, the SAMRC regularly rated that unit among the top 2 or 3 in its group. I'm also a best-selling author of books, including Law of Running, which became known as the Runner's Bible. Publishers rated it globally as the 9th best ever in its category. Together with Springbok rugby legend Morné du Plessis, in 1995 I co-founded the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. This would become a beacon of South African excellence for the application of science in the practice of sport. Perhaps more significantly during that former life, I challenged accepted medical and scientific dogmas 6 times. Each time I was proved correct, and my view eventually became accepted mainstream teaching. The most significant of these contributions was to disprove the prevailing dogma that during all forms of exercise, a catastrophic failure of human whole-body physiology, beginning in our exercising muscles, imposes significant limits on human performance. This theory, which British Nobel laureate Professor Archibald Vivian Hill advanced as a novel idea in 1923, had dominated the exercise sciences, and it survived uncontested by successive generations of exercise scientists. That was before I became the first to challenge it decisively in 1996. Remarkably, Hill published very little experimental proof to support his hypothesis. His work deftly confirmed the principle that a new theory requires much less evidence for its original acceptance than its ultimate refutation would demand. In my new and what some have considered pseudo-scientific life after 2010, I would learn that there is no better example of this truth than Ansel Keys's diet-heart hypothesis. Yet, through a series of logical deductions and relatively simple experiments, I led a research team that disproved Hill's hypothesis with relative ease. Instead, we proposed that the human brain determines our athletic performance by anticipating what lies ahead from the moment any exercise bout begins. According to those predictions, our brain then sets the limits of how hard it will allow us to push ourselves. It does this to ensure that we reach the finish of all exercise sessions with some physical reserve and still alive. Our model, grandly titled the Central Governor Model of Exercise Regulation, represents perhaps one of the more important advances in exercise sciences of the past century. I then led our team to disprove the dehydration myth. That was the industry-driven fallacy that unless we humans drink as much as tolerable, we risk our health every time we exercise, especially in the heat. Our publication in 1991 established beyond doubt that this advice can be deadly. It may even cause the novel potentially fatal, utterly preventable medical condition known as exercise-associated hyponatremic encephalopathy, EAHE, in some susceptible humans. As I detailed in my book, Waterlogged, The Serious Problem of Overhydration in Endurance Sports, EAHE has caused the avoidable deaths of scores of athletes and military personnel since 1981. That was when we were the first to recognize and describe the condition. Importantly, sports medicine authorities ignored our definitive 1991 evidence that simply ensuring that athletes do not overdrink during exercise will prevent EAHE. Indeed, an industry seemingly intent on selling as much product to athletes as possible still disregards those definitive findings, ostensibly oblivious of the consequences. We have made other, rather less spectacular scientific advances. These include disproving an improbable theory first advanced in the early 1970s that running 42-kilometer marathons confers lifelong immunity from coronary heart disease, our finding that catastrophic neck injuries in the sport of rugby are not random chance events, but rather occur under predictable circumstances, and that the dehydration that naturally occurs during exercise does not cause the occasional cases of exercise-associated heat stroke in running and other similar sports, as a result encouraging athletes to drink more during exercise, another false feature of the dehydration myth, will not prevent cases of heat stroke. During that former life, I also convinced Jake White, coach of the 2007 Rugby World Cup winning Springbok rugby team, to rest key players at crucial periods in the final year before the 2007 competition. This advice was profoundly unconventional and provoked indignant attacks on me in the press and on social media. How could I, who clearly knew so little about the sport, possibly suggest that professional rugby players needed to rest? After all, they are paid, too much according to some, to play rugby. It is their job. The error these critics made was a failure to understand the delicate balance between winning major competitions, such as the Rugby World Cup that happens every 4 years, and playing just enough competitive rugby in the preceding 4 years. My unconventional approach came from the best source. It was based on what I had learned from studying athletes in other sports. In the end, according to Coach White, I contributed significantly to the Springboks' ultimate victory. He later kindly wrote, "I had full faith in what Tim said because I knew he genuinely wanted South Africa to win. I always had the feeling in every meeting we had that he genuinely wanted to find ways in which we could have the edge over the opposition. And he never gave me reason to doubt him. He never said to us, 'Don't do it like that, do it like this.' He always gave you options and the pros and cons of both options." Another previously and overwhelmingly unpopular position I adopted, albeit cautiously in public for fear of retaliatory action, was that cyclist Lance Armstrong was the most doped athlete in the history of sport. An editorial I wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine began with the question, "Is it possible for the natural athlete who competes without chemical assistance to achieve record-breaking performances in sports requiring strength, power, speed, or endurance?" My answer in the article was a resounding no. My closing argument featured the story of Werner Reiterer. In disclosing his own drug-enhanced performances, former Australian world discus champion Werner Reiterer, who chose to retire rather than risk winning a tainted medal in the 2000 Olympic Games in Sydney, has written, "There was something pathetically wrong with the fact that a packed home arena, an entire country, would urge me on without any concept of the truth behind my ultimate athletic achievement, or of the sham of which they were unwittingly a part." I concluded, "Our burden is that no longer do we share this ignorance. We can no longer pretend that we do not know." 7 years later, Lance Armstrong was exposed as, well, yes, the mastermind responsible for the most sophisticated, professionalized, and successful doping program that sport has ever seen. That was according to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency report that finally exposed him. In my mind, the most incriminating evidence against Armstrong was not what he said, it was what he failed to say. Not once did he complain that other cyclists were doping. If he was truly competing without the aid of drugs, surely he should have emphasized repeatedly that he was winning despite competing at a significant disadvantage. But he never did, confirming his guilt, to me at any rate. In time, I realized that any such failure to state the obvious is also a definitive test of the true allegiance of individuals or organizations outwardly committed to making us healthier. Those who refuse to state that the monopoly of companies responsible for the toxic modern food environment are the primary drivers of ill health confirm that they have no interest in our health. Whether witting or unwitting, these individuals and organizations usually prove to be nothing other than hired hands for those interests that benefit the most from rising rates of global ill health. I return to this theme in Chapter 18. But there is another lesson from the Armstrong saga. David Walsh, who had concluded in 1999 that Armstrong was a fraud, Lance Armstrong perpetuated what may well be the most outrageous, cold-blooded, and elaborate lie in the history of sport, spent the next 13 years pursuing the truth. Of his experience, he wrote, "How can you reveal the truth if those to whom you are speaking don't want to hear?" The UCI, Union Cycliste Internationale, didn't want to know their sport was diseased. The Tour de France preferred to turn a blind eye to the circus the race had become, and too many fans couldn't bear to be told the saints were sinners. Walsh wrote of the small group of whistleblowers who finally exposed the truth. What set Emma O'Reilly, Betsy Andreu, Stephen Swart and Greg LeMond apart was their willingness to tell the truth at a time when there was nothing in it for them except vilification and other forms of bullying. Whistleblowers, my experience would teach me, should expect no favors. Between 2004 and 2007, I used my medical and scientific skills to assist UCT graduate Lewis Pugh to become the first person in history to swim 1 kilometer in water of -1.8 degrees Celsius at the geographical North Pole. One outcome was that the United Nations Environment Programme named Pew Patron of the Oceans. In 2016, after 5 years of negotiations, he successfully convinced the Russian government to remove their veto and support his campaign to have the Ross Sea in Antarctica declared a marine protected area. That has made the Ross Sea the largest protected area on land or sea. In his negotiations with the Russians, Pew became known as the Speedo diplomat. In the Antarctic summer of 2016-17, he turned his attention to swims off the Antarctic Peninsula, hoping to add the seas off East Antarctica, the Weddell Sea, and the Bellingshausen Sea to the list of marine protected areas by 2020. As a result of some of these contributions, at least 2, Waterlogged and the Central Governor Model of Exercise Regulation, considered seminal, UCT bestowed on me its highest degree, Doctor of Science at age 53. According to a developing fable, all that ended on 13 December 2010, when, as a new generation of critics claimed, I apparently turned my back on my former life of dedicated hardcore science. After that day, I began my descent into quackery, as my critics would have it. Because of this narrative, beginning in 2011, I converted overnight into just another self-aggrandizing celebrity imposter, a snake oil salesman promising miracle cures to a gullible public. Critics seemed to believe that the nutrition path I was now advocating was based on nothing more than anecdote and my misleading suggestions of a placebo effect without any biological basis. According to this account, to boost my profile, I had begun to work tirelessly to cherry-pick data and suppress any information that disproved my dogma about the benefits of low-carbohydrate, high-fat, LCHF diets. I did so, according to their theory, in part by attacking my opponents publicly. My goal, apparently, was to berate, humiliate, and silence anyone brave enough to challenge my opinions. And so, in a few short months, I morphed from a distinguished scientist with a globally acknowledged reputation into a faith-based nutrition activist, ruthlessly advocating an unproven, clearly dangerous fad diet. The reality, as I explain in this book, is rather different. My scientific conversion came about after what I call my Damascene moment. It happened after I came face to face with compellingly robust evidence that contradicted everything I believed was true about optimum nutrition to treat and prevent serious diseases, such as obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. I started to question whether much of what my professors at medical school had taught me as incontrovertible nutrition truths were, in fact, no more than myths, lies even. Much as with the other 6 myths that I disproved when I was a perfectly ordinary hardcore scientist, I challenged 2 deeply held dogmas, the role of carbohydrate in nutrition and the diet-heart hypothesis that saturated fat causes heart disease. I was left facing an ethical dilemma of monumental proportions. I'd spent the better part of 34 years disseminating nutritional advice both locally and internationally to patients and athletes, not least through the pages of Law of Running that I now knew to be wrong. Not just wrong, but in all likelihood harmful to many, especially those with insulin resistance, IR, and pre-diabetes. I had 2 options. I could either continue preaching these wrong and potentially harmful lies and maintain the scientific nutrition status quo, the so-called conventional wisdom, or I could admit my errors, try to correct them, and deal with the consequences. For me, there was no choice. I had been raised by parents who viewed honesty, truthfulness, and taking responsibility for your actions as ethical absolutes. I knew that to honor their lives, I had no option other than to acknowledge my errors and live with the consequences. In my mind, I was doing what any good scientist does when faced with incontrovertible evidence that contradicts a view, no matter how deeply held. I changed my mind. I expected that my colleagues in the medical profession, I'm also a medical doctor, although I have not practiced clinical medicine for more than 17 years, and in academia, including my own university, would be intrigued. They would want to know why I had changed my mind. They would be open to dialogue on matters of science and evidence-based medicine. They would want to learn. I could not have been more wrong. The results of my personal choice would prove brutal for myself, my wife, and the rest of our family.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?